This morning as the world commemorates Environment Day, and in studio we do have Dr. Richard Munang, who is the Deputy Regional Director Africa at UNEP. Once again, welcome to the show this morning.
Thank you. All
right, and most of the time when we hear the World Environment Day, what comes to the minds of many people is planting of trees, so that and planting of trees translates to environmental conservation. But as an expert, what should environmental conservation really entail?
Yeah, thank you very much again for having me. And as you rightly said, today is 5th June, World Environment Day, and the theme is to beat plastic pollution. But on top of that, we have also what we call the triple planetary crises, which are the crisis of climate change, crisis of waste and pollution, and also crisis of biodiversity loss, which comes as a result of human activity on the environment that is actually taking us down this path of destruction. And therefore, conservation becomes very, very important, and planting of trees is one of them. Yeah. But the theme today of beating plastic pollution is coming because the world is actually under the weight of plastics. Yeah. As we're speaking, 430 million tons of plastic are actually getting into the environment every year. And out of these 430 million, 29 million of them are actually getting into ecosystems, into our rivers, into our lakes. And as a result of these, 10 million, between 8 to 10 million gets into our ocean. And that literally means one truck of plastics getting into the ocean every minute. Yeah. And as a result of this, we are having issues from both the economic side, the health side, and the environmental side. And that is why today it's about awareness, but at the same time, also the actions that individual citizens can take, corporations can take, and governments can take.
And we've seen efforts by governments, including the government of Kenya. We do have a 15 billion initiative campaign for planting trees. And most of these campaigns really highlight and try to insinuate that when we plant trees, and that's the solution to the climate change and, let's say, environmental conservation. But how can plastic pollution frustrate the efforts to conserve the environment, irrespective of how many trees we've planted as a nation? Yeah.
The reality is that when we put things in perspective, the impact of plastic on the environment is huge. Because first of all, when you look at fish, it is estimated that by 2050 we'll have more plastic in sea than fish by weight. Yeah. But at the same time, the statistics that we are seeing is that sea turtle, sea whales, all of them have plastic in them today, and that indirectly translates to humans when they consume this, and that is causing health effect, neuron disorder, infertility, and all other aspects. But more importantly, when it comes to biodiversity loss, which is actually very, very fundamental to the economies. If you take the blue economy, the African continent actually is worth $300 billion with potential to create over 49 million jobs. So when you break it down to Kenya here, the share of blue economy for Kenya is $4.4 billion with potential to create 52 million jobs each and every year. And therefore, the destruction of plastic pollution is economically and also environmentally impactful. But when it comes to planting of the 15 billion trees, that is very, very important, because first of all, it is not just responding to building climate resilience, but at the same time, it's creating jobs, especially for young people, especially when fruit trees are planted. And at the same time, the resilience in terms of erosion that is already happening as a result of human destruction, the cutting down of trees. Yeah. But with plastics, what we need to do, and actually this day aims to do that, is what solutions can actually be put in place that addresses economic dimension as well as environmental and health.
And developed countries have been accused of being, for example, the greatest emitters and polluters. And that's why during COP27, we had a resolution of having a funding to the loss and damage. But when it comes to plastic pollution, are the statistics the same? Are we seeing more pollution coming from the developed world, or this time round, when it's about plastic pollution, then even the developing world is contributing more?
Africa contributes 6% to plastic production. Yeah. That means that 94% is not from the continent today. But what we need to understand about plastic is that it's transboundary. The shores of Africa and Asia carries 90% of plastic in ocean.
Yeah.
And this is not necessarily produced by the continent. It's produced by other parts of the world. But the most important aspect is that to address that issue, it cannot be done only from a country or from a continent perspective. It needs to be done globally. And that is why the current negotiation that is going on now, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, to come out with a plastic treaty by 2024 is very, very important. But back to your question, which is quite very key from the perspective of climate change, the production of plastics in the entire chain is actually producing emissions that are equivalent to the emissions of the entire African continent. Because the entire African continent is a negligible continent. It produces emissions by just 3 to 4%.
Yeah.
But plastic production, if that was a country or a continent, it would be Africa, produces between 3 to 4% as well.
Yeah.
And that means addressing plastic pollution is indirectly addressing climate change because the emissions will be reduced. That also means that if we are able to reduce plastic pollution, countries, for example, like Kenya, have actually pledged to cut emissions by 32% by 2030. And reduction of plastic pollution by recycling, by reusing, by diversifying to other alternatives would help reduce also emissions and help the country to be able to address the changing climate that is pledged to cut.
Yes.
But when it comes to the funding, the treaty is going to address this. But more importantly, from the perspective of climate change, which you did ask, COP27 came out with the Loss and Damage Fund, which currently is being negotiated and will further be negotiated in COP28 in UAE, the United Arab Emirates. But the most important aspect is that from precedents, when these agreements to create funds are put in place, it usually takes between 5 to 7 years. But what matters is that there is going to be a loss and damage fund, which countries are negotiating on the modalities of how that is going to look like.
And it's very clear, last year we had campaigns on reducing emissions because the campaign was very clear that when these emissions are not reduced, then there's a lot of CO2 released leading to global warming. Let's talk about the direct impact of plastic pollution, just the way we know that CO2 will lead to global warming and climate change and all that. So let's now talk about the impact of plastic pollution, either on global warming, on not just environment, but as far as climate change is concerned, so that we understand the consequences that has there.
Yes, when you look at it from the economic perspective, just in 2019 alone, the cost of plastic to the economy, to the environment, and to health was $3.7 trillion alone. And each and every year, the cost of plastic to the economy ranges between 300 to 600 billion each and every year. That is a lot of money. And when you dovetail down to the continent, what we are talking here, we are talking at opportunities that have been lost. But also at the same time, when you look at health, plastic actually choke and block drainage systems, resulting to waterborne diseases, resulting to creating spaces for breeding of mosquitoes that cause malaria. But it's also been proven that plastic ending up in fish, in water, in what is called microplastics, because actually it takes 400 years for plastics to degenerate into microplastics, and that still ends up in the food chain, where what you eat, you still eat plastics that have detrimental impact on health. So what is more important at the moment, in addition to aquatic life, where marine life, like I mentioned earlier, whether it is fish or it is whales, consuming this plastic are actually not only destroying, but also ending up in human bodies. But what is more important is how do we really address this? Which there are 3 dimensions, like I mentioned earlier. To address the issue of plastic, we need a transboundary approach, because the plastic that end up in African shores or coastlines, most of them do not come from Africa, and Africa only produces 6% of in the entire plastic production in the entire world. But Africa also imports over 70% of plastic. And to address that, that needs to be done through bringing the entire global community. And during the United Nations Environment Assembly 5.2, which took place in March last year, countries, 196 of them, came together and adopted a resolution to create the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, which currently, as we speak, they had a meeting in Paris last week agreeing to the first draft of text that will potentially be discussed and be adopted in 2024. And the second aspect that is quite very, very key is that when you look at countries across the world and more so in the African continent, Africa is actually a leader when it comes to putting legislation in place, when it comes to passing laws and policies. If you take Kenya, Kenya banned plastic in 2017. And when you look at the Constitution of Kenya, Article 42, which enshrines environment in it and actually protecting environment as a right. And when you look at the Climate Act of 2016, at the statutory regulatory perspective, these are actually anchored. But the difference comes into turning those into implementation. And I think this is really where we're going to have more further discussion.
And for example, it's easy to relax knowing that as a continent, we don't produce more plastics, but you mentioned that we import more of this. So does this place, because the fact that we import more means we also use a lot of plastics, does this place us at par as far as use of plastics, and let me say plastic pollution is concerned, with the countries that produce in large quantities?
Well, at the end of the day, it's not only those who produce, because they produce and it ends up somewhere.
Yes.
It is a collective responsibility of each and every one, because the reality, as I said earlier, when there is a downpour and there is flooding because plastic have actually blocked drainage systems, it's people who suffer in that community or in that constituency. When fish that is eaten have plastic in it that end up causing health effects, that is an issue that is no longer where it was produced, but it is at the individual or family issue. So looking at it from a holistic perspective of how do we ensure that plastic that is produced do not end up in our oceans, do not end up in our food systems, but stay in the economy. And that is why last 2 weeks, UNEP released a report titled Turning Off the Tap. And this report showed that if we are to reuse, to recycle, to reorientate and diversify approaches on how we deal with plastic, we're going to reduce plastic by 80% in 17 years from today. And as a result of that, we're going to reduce emissions that are contributing to climate change by 25%. And more importantly, create over 700,000 jobs, which means that actually beating plastic pollution is an alternative to creating viable economies and jobs for our young people.
Yeah, and as a country, I'm talking about Kenya, that hosts the International Environment Program, I would be interested to know how my country is doing in Africa as far as controlling or curbing plastic pollution is concerned. Yeah.
Kenya is actually a leader when it comes to beating plastic pollution. I indicated earlier that Kenya did ban single-use plastic and have actually led the charge, not only in banning, but in your constitution, Article 42, the protection of environment is enshrined. And more to that, in your budget, the finance bill of 2019-2020, Kenya actually removed 16% VAT for those who are dealing with services in plastic recycling. That is actually very, very bold step taken. And more importantly, for investors that are investing in plastic recycling, the taxes they are supposed to pay dropped from 30% to 15%. This is progress that is being made. But I think the most important question should be, if these actions from a regulatory, from physical incentive perspective are put in place, why are we still choking under plastics? Exactly. And I think the answer is very simple. The regulatory dimension is important, but the economic dimension cannot be lost. And that is why it is very, very important that the regulatory dimension and alternatives to be able to incentivize actions actually take center stage. Because as we're speaking like this, there are a lot of young people right here in Kenya who are turning plastic waste into pavement tiles that are replacing concrete blocks. And they are creating jobs for themselves and also for the youth. There are young people in Nigeria who are turning plastic waste into apparels, making bags out of plastics, making shoes out of plastics and dresses. So what needs to be done is to piggyback on some of these successful stories and provide incentives to these young people in terms of financial incentives, as well as also integrating these solutions into school curriculum so that everybody become part and parcel of seeing plastic as wealth in disguise and knowing that this is where jobs can actually be created.
Yeah, and let's talk about now actions that governments, apart from of course supporting the young people that are coming up with innovative ideas on how to utilize or use plastics in a better way that is environment friendly. What actions should governments then take, not just governments but also environment bodies like UNEP and other organizations so that this problem is addressed once and for all?
UNEP produces the science, and the report that I did mention, Turning Off the Tap, that was released just 2 weeks ago, clearly stated what needs to be done from both a policy perspective, from both behavioral perspective, and what we could get as a global community if that is done. And the results were very clear. 700,000 jobs will be created, plastic will be reduced by 80%. But when it comes to government, as I said, out of 54 African countries, 34 of them do have legislation in place or a policy in place that have to do with banning plastics. That is impressive. But what is missing is the aspect of implementation, and also the fact that they put in place these policies, these legislations, and the incentives from a physical perspective. There is still not an acceleration in picking this up. And they have to do three things. And one of the things is that the policies to ban plastic or to reduce plastic need to be put in what we call investment plan. Because if you go to buy something in a market, you will buy it based on what it's worth in terms of your money. And so when the plastic bans and policies are put in place, it is very, very important that there is an investment plan that shows that if you were to reuse plastic, this is what you can gain. If you are to recycle plastic, these are the opportunities of return on investment so that business people and investors can start to invest in it. If you were to reorientate and diversify to other alternatives, because there are young people in Kenya, in Lake Victoria, that are turning water hyacinth into alternative biodegradable bags. That's a business venture. What is the return on investment for more people to get into that? And that is really an important aspect that government needs to do. The second aspect is, when you look at the entire African continent today, the 80% of the continent is in the informal sector. Our young people, who constitute over 60% of the entire population, are in the informal sector. And at the same time, 54% of this informal sector are actually waste pickers, and most of them pick these plastics, and this is similar to what happens also in Kenya here across the continent. But the most important aspect is that they do not have access to capital. And even when there is potential for them to have access to capital, most of them are not qualified, because Africa actually have the highest lending level of capital in the entire world. It's very expensive to lend out money, and therefore what needs to be done is what is called developing a blended finance de-risking tool, which is very simple, that governments can start to use accessible structures like chamas, like cooperatives, like they call them in West Africa, or microfinance organizations, so that these young people who are already carrying out work in the plastic arena can be able to access this affordable finance. But that is not all. We need to also de-risk, not only in terms of money, but coming up with policies that actually integrate and make plastic pollution solutions part of the entire school curriculum. Not only in formal education, but even to polytechnics and TVETs, like they call them here, across the continent, so that young people are coming out knowing that plastic presents a business opportunity, and they can be able to create jobs within that.
And I remember when Kenya was banning plastics, there was a lot of resistance because so many people were earning through even sale and use of plastics. We've also seen resistance from developed world when it comes to cutting on emissions because a lot of jobs are at stake. So when we come back, we want to take a short break. We shall talk about resistance, if countries are really embracing this and what challenges that UNEP is facing to ensure that cutting on plastic or beating plastic pollution as the campaign is achieved. We take a short breather right here at the KTN News Center. Remember, today is World Environment Day and the campaign is on beating plastic pollution. In studio, we have Dr. Richard Munang, who is the Deputy Regional Director for Africa at the UNEP. We continue this conversation shortly. Don't go too far. Right, and thank you so much for staying with the KTN News Center. Today is World Environment Day. We are having a conversation regarding beating plastic pollution. That's the campaign for this year, even as the theme focuses on solutions to plastic pollution. And our guest this morning is Dr. Richard Munang, who is the Deputy Regional Director for Africa at the UNEP. Thank you so much. And we have said so much about the consequences of plastic pollution for both economies and the planet. But what, as an expert, as UNEP, would you like to see in terms of policies by governments? Because, for example, like I had mentioned, we have a wonderful campaign on tree planting led by President William Ruto's administration on ensuring that we plant at least 15 billion trees, which is great in addressing climate change. But what would you like to see in terms of policies, and have you seen any wonderful policies by Kenya, other African countries, and also in the continent where countries that are lagging behind can pick some lessons from those areas? Yeah,
I think that's a very important point you're bringing up. And as I started off by saying, Kenya and many African countries are leaders. 34 out of 54 African countries do have policies when it comes to plastic issues. And if you take Kenya, banning single-use plastic, getting up to the incentive level to be able to actually give tax breaks to investors who are actually investing in plastic recycling. But I think one of the key aspects is policy is important because it's the biggest driver of change and it needs to be in place. But what has been missing sometimes in this equation is that it's citizens who implement policy. And while the citizens actually do not have the right skills, regardless of the number of policies that are put in place, they might never be optimally implemented. And therefore, skills retooling of young people becomes very, very important on how they can be able to see opportunities in plastic, on how to turn plastic to pavement tiles, like some young people are already doing. Can this become part and parcel of curriculum, which I think from a policy perspective, the educational curriculum in every country across the continent needs to be looked into. So the educational policy where environmental solutions, especially plastic solutions in turning plastic waste to plastic opportunity, need to become part and parcel so that it become ingrained, not just as a subject, but as an entrepreneurial pathway for young people to actually start turning plastic into different opportunities, whether it is apparels or whether it is plastic tiles or roofing tiles, which I mentioned that young people are doing. The second aspect that I think is quite very, very important is that at individual level, not only young people, we need to start looking at how do we also play our part in contributing to transformational development and at the same time beating this plastic pollution and seizing opportunities in it, which means we must become passionate about environmental solutions and do so also knowing that pollution, especially plastic pollution, is actually a disguised world. And so we have to learn that, and that's part of skills retooling. The other aspect which I did mention earlier is access to finance, which I think that with a lot of young people with entrepreneurial ingenuity and ideas usually get stuck as they find that accessing finance become difficult. So I think apart from government providing incentives or coming up with de-risking tools to be able to incentivize private sector to lend, private sector should also play their part, which I know they are playing their part, but they need to go beyond that to actually know that at least they can be able to start offering not just internship, but also creating training centers that can capacitate and give youth the skills to then be part of the chain that can help turn this plastic pollution into opportunities.
And when you talk about addressing climate change and cutting on gas emission, I want to go back there. During Trump administration, we all know he refused to an agreement on a gas emission because that meant doing away with their industries, which would hugely affect the economy. So we've seen resistance from countries, and they're the same countries, the developed world, that produce in large quantities. The largest percentages of plastic production is from the developed world. Without them having to feel that we are going to affect our countries, the economies of our countries, what best can be done so that, yes, we reduce on plastic pollution, but at the same time, we take care of our economies, because that's the agenda of every president. Yeah.
Very, very important, and that is why the world came together.
Yeah.
And they are currently negotiating the treaty, the plastic treaty that will come into force in 2024.
Yeah.
Because this is not an issue to be solved by an individual country, and we are all in this together. Like I mentioned, 430 million tons of plastic are getting into the oceans each and every year. The aquatic life that is being lost, and the health aspect that no one is immune to it, even if you live in the north or in the south. When you eat that fish with microplastic inside, it's going to affect your health. When you drink that water with microplastic inside, you are not going to be well. And therefore, it's a universal health issue. It's a universal economic issue. When you cannot be able to address the issues that you have in your country because you have a sick population, definitely you have an impact in your economy. And it is an environmental issue. When there is flooding and your flooding pathways are clogged with plastic, that becomes a challenge. So I think globally, the benefits outweigh inaction, because the UNEP report, turning off the tap, showed that the savings as a result of reusing plastic, recycling plastic, reorienting our approaches and changing our behaviors and diversifying to other alternatives like biodegradables, like reusing what we produce and keeping it within the economy, will save the world $4.5 trillion US. And I think any country, anywhere in the world, should actually be jubilating that beating plastic pollution is the best way to drive transformational economic growth.
And on that note, probably you can talk about the UNEP's roadmap to cutting the global plastic pollution.
Actually, during the UNEP 5.2, which was in March 2022, 196 countries did adopt a resolution which is to establish an international negotiating committee, which just last week, the second meeting that took place in Paris, actually agreed to the draft text, which in November this year, they will be having the third session that will be happening in Nairobi, Kenya. And that is a pathway towards developing this internationally legally binding agreement that will hold every country responsible for their actions, that will help member states design policies, put acts in place that can then be able to incentivize actions to ensure reusing, recycling, reorienting, and diversifying opportunities to tap into these trillions of dollars that I've mentioned. And that is the first stage. The second stage is policy, as I indicated, is the biggest driver of change. And international treaties are ratified at national level. And it then up to countries again to ratify, but Africa is already showing they're taking lead, because I indicated 34 African countries do have either a policy or a law in place to be able to address plastic pollution. But that is not enough. The ratification must move to implementation. And that is where turning the treaty, the policies into investment plans become really the most important aspect that every country should start thinking and looking into now.
And we still have countries that are yet to ban plastic use. We will talk about that. But let's talk about the plastic treaty negotiations that have been ongoing at Paris. Maybe what do we need to know about those, the conversations that are ongoing? The
conversation is pretty much addressing these issues that I've already mentioned, because every countries are sovereign states, and the agreement with a resolution that was adopted during the United Nations Environment Assembly 5.2 in March 2022, was for the world to come together and have a legally binding agreement. And that is already a very big win for the entire global community, because they've recognized the problem. There is a huge problem, and every member state knows and have agreed that this is something to be solved. The mechanics of the agreement is the reason why this international negotiating committee is taking place. And like with every agreement, there are processes negotiating the text, which now there is a draft text, which potentially will be finalized and get into force by 2024 next year. That is these are the steps, and the next event will take place in Nairobi here in November.
We welcome that step. But, let's talk about the political goodwill from the world leaders. Would you say you are receiving enough support from the leadership, and I'm saying the country at the top leadership, presidents and the ministers that are involved? Or what are some of the challenges that UNEP and other organizations are facing in implementing the environment, especially plastic pollution program?
There is goodwill.
Yeah.
That is why there was the adoption of the resolution in 2022 to create this legally binding. So the countries that are negotiating are 196. That's all the countries that are with the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the environment parliament of the world. But when you come down to the African continent, as I said, there are 34 African countries that do already have a policy in place or a law in place to ban plastic, even with that the legally binding agreement in place, which means that a legally binding agreement coming into force in 2024 will further incentivize many African countries to put in place policies and even act if possible. But I go back to that point again. That is a step in the right direction, and it should be accelerated. However, policy is excellent and is the biggest driver of change, but it is just as important when it is turned into implementation. And those who implement policies are citizens. They're individual citizens, they're corporations, they're academia, they're NGOs, they're civil societies, they're everybody in the community. And therefore, starting to engage them now is very, very important, so that at least they can see the opportunities. And that's why during these negotiations and discussions, like was in Paris, there were informal sector actors, especially informal waste pickers, because we have over 20 million of them across the entire world. And in the African continent today, as indicated, 54% of those who pick plastic waste are actually informal actors, who constitute over 80% of the entire African workforce. And therefore, engaging them and giving them access to finance so that they can be able to access protective gear in creating their enterprises and being safe in the process of turning plastic waste or picking plastic so that at least it can be picked up by recyclers, will create money in the process and at the same time contribute to the implementation of these policies that are in place. So from the policy perspective that is being negotiated down to the national level where this will be ratified and legislated, the dimension of implementation cannot be ignored.
And when African leaders, when they were going into the COP27, they said this time we are going with one voice to have the countries that are responsible for largest emissions, quote unquote, punished, all right, or take responsibility for the loss and damage. And most of the time, the issue of honoring the commitment is usually the greatest problem when it comes to honoring these. And now we are going into COP28. We're still having conversations about loss and damage, and we might still have that conversation at COP28 repeated when countries committed. So let's talk about the challenges that UNEP and other countries that are committed face to getting them, because countries feel like you are the neutral party as UNEP, but when it comes to countries, Africa feels that the Western, the developed world should take responsibility over this, and therefore most of these meetings end up bearing no fruits. So what is the best way to address the issue of plastic pollution and climate change so that we don't have, we don't want to see people walking out of those meetings with no solution?
There have been huge progress in these meetings, especially with the latest that happened in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, where there was, for the first time in the history of COPs, an agreement to create the loss and damage fund. That is progress. Progress might not be as fast as it should be, but I think if we do not appreciate progress, we will never make meaningful progress.
Sure.
The second aspect is that the UNEP have been at the forefront of not just providing the science, but ensuring that the science actually inform policies. And that is why during the run-up to COP, UNEP produced what is called the emissions gap report that shows where the world is heading if no action is taken. And if you look at the emissions in the world, the way we're headed today, we're actually going to hit 2.7 degrees. But at the same time, Africa is actually warming twice as fast as the rest of the world, which means if the temperatures increase, the level in Africa will be twice as fast. And that gave not just voice to the entire world, but also voice to the African continent to show the stakes that they are in. UNEP also produced the adaptation gap report that shows the gap in financing adaptation to build resilience of communities, to ensure that the ecosystems can be restored, waters can continue to flow, our food systems can actually be strengthened. And that shows the gap, which then helps countries to then be able to negotiate from an informed position. It is the same with plastic negotiation, where UNEP did release this report 2 weeks ago, turning off the tap, that showed clearly what needs to be done and what will you benefit as a country when you take this particular plastic solution to reduce plastics. For example, when you reuse plastic, when you recycle plastic, and when you diversify, you are going to tap into 1.27 trillion US dollars. And providing this science help inform these negotiations, because UNEP's role is to convene, is to provide sound science to then inform policy, but at the same time also inspire actors to be able to take environmental action that can be able to drive transformational development. But what we need to understand in all these processes is that multilateralism in terms of negotiating with all the countries in the world is not a walk in a park, because every country comes with its own internal interests from the perspective of what the country also wants, and there needs to be a compromise. But the beauty is, when it comes to an issue like climate change, we have the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which countries have ratified, meaning that they are seeing the inherent opportunity in taking climate action. That is progress. When it comes to plastic, there is a resolution that created the International Negotiation Committee that now have a draft that they're negotiating that will come into force in 2024. That is progress. I do understand that sometimes we would need progress to happen the next day because of the magnitude of the challenge, but we also need to be cognizant of the fact that progress made albeit small steps can actually inspire.
Right, and finally, if plastic pollution and the campaigns is to be taken with the seriousness that it deserves, then what sort of commitments as environmental expert do you expect from those attending the international event at Côte d'Ivoire today?
The World Environment Day is an event that is for everyone in the entire world, for individual citizens to be able to play their part, to ensure that at least instead of just throwing away plastic, you can actually recycle that plastic, and it's an opportunity for you. It's for governments to be able to ratchet up not just the ambition in terms of passing more laws, but also to put in place implementation plans that can then help accelerate the operationalization of the policies that they do have in place. It's an opportunity for corporations to understand that they have more opportunities when they diversify and they reorientate their operations and they reuse and recycle, rather than putting more plastic into the planet, into the environment, because it results to emission. And it is actually predicted that if this approach continues, by 2050, the amount of plastic that will be resulting to emissions will be equivalent to 615 coal plants. And therefore, that will be destruction for the entire world in terms of emissions that will result to higher warming. It therefore means that what is happening in Côte d'Ivoire today is also happening in Kenya, here in Nakuru. And if you go down to the grassroots level, young people within their own volition, are volunteering selflessly to plant trees. They're volunteering selflessly to showcase the work they are doing. Actually, on Twitter today, before I came over here, I saw young people across the entire continent showcasing what they are doing with turning plastic into different alternatives. I saw them displaying plastic bags, pavement tiles, and I think it's an opportunity for governments and actors, whether from corporations, to then start to look at how they can build on these successes and provide alternatives and opportunities for these young people.
All right, Dr. Richard Munang, thank you so much for making time for us. We have to wrap it up, and thank you for watching KTN News Center this morning as Kenya joins the world to commemorate Environment Day. We've been speaking with the regional Deputy Regional Director for Africa at the UNEP. I am Purity Museo Nzuki. I'll see you again at 1 o'clock with the news desk. Keep watching KTN.